I wanted to talk about the ever-present racism, or is it pandering, or like that quote says, and I don't know who coined it, the low expectations of bigotry. Because it's not a new phenomenon, okay? I mean, there's a lot of shows now, and like that documentary, Everything is Gonna Be All White, where they're blaming the white man for everything and all their woes, as if blacks and whites haven't interacted since forever and didn't have a life or success or their own families and so on, or were represented on television, which is the point of this video. For example, I grew up watching Good Times. What's happening now? Nell. That's actually the actress's name, who's unforgettable, which is why it sticks. But the show was actually called Gimme a Break. And there were so many others, such as The Cosby Show, The Jeffersons, Benson. The list goes on. Now, when you think about the characters of these shows, the black ones anyway, so in terms of representation, in the Jeffersons, they were a married couple. They were friends with a biracial couple who were well off, and the black woman was the wife. And she also lived in a building on the Upper East Side. And then they had a black maid named Florence, right? The one who had the sassy attitude. But she was working for a black family. And one scene in particular stood out to me because of everything that's happening now, where Florence thought, or she had assumed rather, that Mrs. Jefferson was a maid too. And they had a friendship together, and that she was in that apartment or, going inside that building because she worked there. It hadn't occurred to her that she was actually the lady of the house. Think about that for a moment, because these two women are both black. One happens to be a maid. One happens to be the one who lives in the apartment and hired or needs a maid. If she were a white woman making that same assumption, she would be called racist, right? In any event, back to the scene. So when she discovered it, she was shocked. And then she meets her friend, which is, I forget her name now, but I know that the actress playing, Helen. Helen was played by Roxy Roker. She happens to be the mother of Lenny Kravitz, by the way, and she passed away some years ago. But my point is that she's looking at Mrs. Jefferson saying, you live in this apartment or in this building? And she says, yes. And then she looks over at Helen and says, you live here too? And Helen says, that's right. And then Florence says, why hadn't anybody told me? We overcome. Or something to that effect, to a roaring laughter, because I think they had live studio audiences at that time, not laugh tracks. And now when I think about it, I think it was actually Helen's maid who thought that Mrs. Jefferson was working there, not Florence. But either way, all the women are black in the scene. But I bring all of this up to say that they weren't negative images of people of color. Who else? There was Sanford and Son. There was Chico and the Man, who was the Latino, not Latinx. In fact, there were less, I think, Latin representation on television than there were black people, because I've always said this through the years, is that black people were American, just like white people, and would have more in common with a white person, because Latin people come from different countries with different customs, and even the Spanish is different depending on where you're from. So Mexicans will say something that people from the Caribbean may not understand, and the foods are different, and so is the music, and even less they might have in common with a black American or a white American. So everything is very nuanced. And it's funny because whenever there is a Spanish person depicted on television, they're usually assumed to be Mexican. Everything is about tacos and other stuff. I don't know. And we can apply this to people coming from Africa or Panama or Jamaica or Trinidad. They may look black, but that doesn't mean they have anything in common with a black American any more than they do with a white one. Anyway, the language is very important here. I suspect this is why it didn't matter that there wasn't enough Latin representation on American television, rather, because a lot of Spanish people, even if they were born here because of their parents and grandparents, a lot of Spanish was spoken in the home either way. And they grew up watching a lot of telenovelas. So American audiences wouldn't be interested in that because, first of all, they wouldn't be able to understand it. And they got their shows through that. And they also had their comedy skits and their own little talk shows and things of that nature. For example, I grew up reading the Bible in Spanish, and when I went to church with my grandmother, we went to a Spanish congregation because that's what she needed to attend to understand. And the blacks and the whites and anyone else who didn't speak Spanish would be in the American side of the congregation, where everyone communicated in English. But back to the shows. Like I said, the Jeffersons were well-to-do. The neighbor Helen was also. But then you had people who had different jobs. And then you had Benson, who was a butler. And Nell was the maid too for a white family. And you would think, oh, well, that's a bad representation of black people. They're not all maids and butlers. But what about Mr. Belvedere? He was a butler. He was white. What about The Nanny, the show that came later that catapulted Fran Drescher to, becoming a household name. She was a Jewish nanny. So people of all backgrounds and colors have different types of jobs from the bottom to the top. And the Cosby Show, when it came out, that was, they said, such a great representation of the Black family and that there should be more of those. It was actually Black people that were complaining about that show that I remember hearing about in person and on TV, because they didn't think it was realistic, because not everybody had money. They didn't live in the hood. They had less in common with a family who had, say, a father as an obstetrician and a mother as an attorney than someone who was just doing a regular 9-to-5 type of job or struggling or whatever. Does this mean to say that every Black person was struggling in the hood? Of course not. My point is that the Black families in the hood, or the ones that were talking about it negatively, were saying that, I guess they thought the Cosbys were some kind of, nerd situation, or too much like white people. They were called goody two-shoes and all that. Sort of what the Republicans or the Black conservatives are called now. That kind of attitude towards the show and the actors in it, or the characters they were playing. Whatever the complaints were, not everybody was on board with that show for other reasons. So you can't please everyone. And it's funny because, speaking of 9-to-5 jobs, or actually the working single mother, I remember that from the show called Alice, who had, I guess, gotten a divorce. I think she went to Arizona. I do recall the show was set in Phoenix. I'm not sure if she moved there or relocated there with her son. And she was struggling, and she was barely making minimum wage or whatever it was at that time. She was always fighting with her boss because she wanted more money. And it was very popular with the women's movement and all that, and equal pay. She was a spokesperson even for that whole movement in many of the marches, and she would appear in her maid uniform because she thought it represented the working woman back then. And no matter what you think about the politics of the time or now, my point is that it wasn't a Black woman being represented as a single struggling working mother. It was a white one. So we have to look at everything from all angles and honestly, because if you just see one episode of that show, and there were others like it, I think it was One Day at a Time, and they had the funny Super Schneider who was always hitting on the mom, and they were also struggling, and yet it was all about feminism and all that. But these women didn't seem to exhibit any white privilege to me. They were having trouble paying the bills because they were struggling as single mothers, and I don't think their skin color was giving them a leg up. And from what you can see, there was a lot of variety, a lot of different situations, and it was affecting all types of people. So there's so many different examples of the different opinions that people had. If we talk about Good Times, the woman who played Florida Evans, Esther Roll, she wasn't going to do the show if there wasn't a father in the family. And she said she wanted that to be the representation for the show, a nuclear family, basically. And she stood firm on that. And I don't know if it's a rumor, because I think she said it on interviews, and so did other people about her, that she was instrumental in there being a dad on the show. They were struggling. They were in the projects, but they were together, and they were a family unit with a mother and a father. And now we get to the pandering piece. Because unbeknownst to me, there were these funny clips of a show called Maude that I didn't watch growing up. I knew about it. I knew who Bea Arthur was. She is Dorothy on The Golden Girls. I recognized her when she was on that program, and I knew she was in some other show in the 70s. But again, I never watched it. And when Betty White passed away, there were a lot of clips of her old interviews and what people have said about her when they were on that show. And then that led to videos about Bea Arthur, and lo and behold, clips of Maude. So one thing leads to another when I went down this nostalgic rabbit hole. And thanks to the YouTube algorithm, more videos kept cropping up. And I happened upon a scene that is very reminiscent of what we're going through today. So when you hear about liberals and how they think that people of color need help, need coddling, need special favors because they can't, say, own an ID to vote, they don't know how to use a computer, or all the other nonsense that you hear them say on interviews when people go on the street and ask them things that contradict what Black people say about themselves. For example, do you think you need ID to vote? And then they'll say, these college white kids will say, oh, well, they have a hard time getting an ID and they don't have access to the same things, and, on and on and on. Well, like I said, the story hasn't changed much, as you will see in the clip I will show you. And for some context, Florida, who is the mother on Good Times, was actually a spinoff from Maude. And she's leaving the position. And I guess that's when her new show begins. But for the show and the storyline, she is going to help her boss, which is Bea Arthur, The name of the show is Maud, and B author is Maud. She's telling Maud, she wants to help out with the interview process. And here she is meeting the woman who applied for the job. Listen to their little exchange, and we'll take it from there.
Hi, I'm Rita Valdez. I'd like to speak to Mrs. Finley.
How did you vote in the last election?
I was out of the state.
Oh, darn it. And your color ain't gonna do you no good.
What's wrong with my color?
You ain't got any. Were you ever busted for walking a picket line or marching in a protest parade?
Of course not.
Well, that's too bad.
Look, what's all this got to do with anything? I'm a good worker. I'm honest, I'm reliable.
Honey, around here that don't mean shoe fly pie. What about your family? Any drunks or ex-convicts?
Are you kidding?
You're gonna be a hard sell. If you want this job, we gotta find something about you that'll feed her guilt. You see, Miss Finley is one of them bleeding heart liberals. That's her steady diet. Cottage, cheese, and guilt.
My parents have never been in any trouble. In fact, ever since they came over here from Puerto Rico, it's been no
Puerto
trouble.
Rico, hold it! Puerto Rico, that goes good with cottage cheese.
Now, couldn't you just take that and put it in the present day with all the CRT things that are going on? In order for her to get the job as a maid, she had to check all the boxes, right? And that's why Florida was asking her all those questions. How does she vote? I guess I'm assuming they want to know if she's a Democrat, I'm sure. See, politics is in everything, even back then. They wanted to know if she attended protests. What a coincidence. That's what we've been seeing now with the BLM and all that stuff. And then she finds out, because she doesn't look the part, right? She doesn't have any color, she tells her. She says, what's wrong with my color? And Florida says, well, you ain't got any. So she's ready to go. She doesn't know what this has to do with anything. She feels that she's qualified for the job, and rightfully so. And then on the end, on her way out, Florida finds out that she's Puerto Rican, and she thinks, well, we figured it out. We got something. You're part of a minority class, and you'll make a good little victim for the job. You're probably going to get hired. And so now we're going to see when she meets Maud and see how Maud reacts to her and what she says, because it's pretty hilarious. Once again, take that and put that in the present day. It's exactly what's going on right now, and the reason behind affirmative action and all those other things. So let's take a listen now to the next clip.
Nice to meet you, Rita. You're not what we had in mind.
Look at this.
Experience: hotel floor maid, 3 years. Assistant to housekeeper.
I mean, where it says
country club.
nationality.
What do I care what her nationality is? People are people, period. It's just that Rita isn't right for the job.
I am sorry you feel that way, senora. I always dreamed of working in a beautiful home like this ever since I came from San Juan to come to New York.
Did you say New York? Walter, our new housekeeper, is Puerto Rican. You poor, poor thing. You must have had a miserable childhood.
Sí, senora. It was muy difícil. Yeah. As a little baby, I worked like a dog in the fields cutting sugarcane. Mi madre and mi padre, they say, we go to Los Estados Unidos.
Where are you, poor thing? In no time, we will have you carefree and laughing.
Oh, senora, I am laughing.
I love a Spanish laugh.
Oh my goodness. When the woman is laughing at her hysterically, I thought that was so clever and genius, because that's exactly how you feel like this is a joke. She's going to take this woman for a ride, because people, when they're being honest, know damn well that whatever these liberals are saying on behalf of them is BS. Like when they say that the cops are killing people in the hood like it's some kind of sport. Where I grew up, I've said this before in previous podcasts, they were bars around the porches. Unsightly, really. And on the windows, too. We're talking about a front porch, a stoop. There were bars. The doors in the old apartments used to have these long iron rods. I think that's what they were made of. And you would fix them into place, and they were like a security measure, like a bolt of some sort. But do you think that the bars on the window were to keep the police out? Or was it to keep it away from people who were living in the neighborhood who were up to no good, or people who were hanging around the neighborhood that were up to no good? So my point is that it wasn't the cops that we feared. Do the cops get out of control and rough people up and have power trips and all that stuff? Of course. And you find that in every field. There's always somebody who doesn't do their job good. But when you look at the numbers, once again, they don't add up. When it comes to the inner city crime, who the victims are, the racial demographic, and the rate of incidences. For instance, we can all say without mincing words that it is the white male who is known to be the serial killer. But what is the race, if we're speaking honestly, of the young males who are doing the homicides and the smash and grabs, whatever they call them, the home invasions, and more? And also, what is the racial demographic of the victims, too? Because they say that more black people are killed by black people than any other race. So people need to be honest about this, and they don't like talking about it because, of course, they call you a racist when it's just the truth. And if you want to talk about, fairness, there's a young man who raped a girl in a Denny's restaurant, as I'm sure you've heard. He was 17 at the time. He was in the women's bathroom, I guess, hiding. I don't know if he had this planned or he was going to rape whoever he saw. I don't know what the hell he was doing in there, if it was premeditated or not. But he raped a 10-year-old girl. I don't know the race of the victim, but the man is white. He's in his 20s now, and apparently because of the laws or the policies in California, they can't do anything about him because he was a minor at the time. And to add insult to injury, many news outlets are referring to this man as a she or a her because she now goes by Hannah. All of a sudden, he's transgender. And he's going to be in the women's population in the prison, although they say he'll be in solitary confinement. I bring this up to say that here's a white person who committed a crime, and there's no outrage in the streets because there's no racial component. Nobody cares when that's not involved in the mix. Where is the justice for this little girl? But I suspect that the left is not upset about this case because it involves a pedophile who gets bonus points for identifying as transgender. And I really got off topic with that one, but my long-winded point to sum it all up was that there's no outrage. And this is also a form of injustice, that this man, no matter his color, could rape a girl in a bathroom. She was only 10. But the black BLM activist who was anti-gun shot at a politician, didn't kill him just because he was, they say, didn't have a good aim. And they raised $100,000 to bail him out of jail because he's suffering from PTSD or something or other since the George Floyd incident took hold of America. But back to the sex offender, I'm not saying he needs to get out of jail or that anybody needs to raise his bail. Au contraire, I'm just saying that they're saying that every time these criminals do something, as in the case with the BLM person, that it's due to their mental health or issues, and there's always this sympathy and empathy attached to it about why they did what they did, as if the victim doesn't have any of those problems. What do you think that girl is going through, using a bathroom and then being attacked in that way? The only reason why they found him was because of his DNA, and he has a rap sheet, so there was a match in the database. Anyway, these old television shows that I brought up today were just to say that not much has changed in the mentality of the liberal. And I do still believe that it is some sort of mental disorder. Until the next video, ciao for now.
Why don't you work it out with Miss Jefferson? I can always get something else from the agency.
Oh, thank you, Florence.
But there's just one thing. Do you folks mind if I ask you something?
No, go right ahead.
You live in this apartment, right?
Uh-huh.
And you got an apartment in this building, too?
Yes, that's right.
Well, how come we overcame and nobody told me?